Welcome to Talking Supply Chain. In each episode, top supply chain industry professionals and the nation's top thought leaders join host Brian Strait and share their unique insights to help supply chain managers stay one step ahead of their competition. This is Talking Supply Chain. Hello, and welcome to this episode of Talking Supply Chain. My name is Brian Strait, and I am editor in chief of Supply Chain Management Review. Today, managing through volatility. VUCA, or volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, can be traced to the mid 1980s. Most accounts attribute it to the American military, but it certainly can apply to almost any situation, including the supply chain. The problem with VUCA is that it can be a crutch. Why didn't your product arrive on time? Well, a ship got stuck in the Suez Canal. A hurricane shut down production for a week. There was a union strike at the plant. In other words, VUCA happened. So, how do we manage around VUCA? Former Gartner supply chain analyst and current VP of Industry Solutions for GAINS, Amber Salley, is joining me today and how we can manage around it. Welcome, Amber. It's great to have you with us.
Great. Thank you for having me, Brian.
To get started, so our audience can get to know you a little bit, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your role and who GAINS is and what you guys do?
Yes, of course. So I am the Vice President of Industry Solutions, as you mentioned. At GAINS, we are a supply chain technology company whose mission is to help our customers deliver against their promises. We have an offering that's called the GAINS Performance Optimization Platform, which has support for supply chain design and your typical supply chain planning activities. So think of demand forecasting, inventory replenishment, through to production planning, inclusive of sales and operations planning, as well as transportation optimization. So a broad base of capabilities to help with planning and designing within the supply chain. Now, our focus is on decisions and decision making and helping companies make higher quality decisions. And we love solving hard problems. So that's why this idea of VUCA is very interesting to us and very relevant for us as well, because we really like to help our customers navigate within complexity and navigate within VUCA. And what we are very proud of is that we are able to deliver on those promises of solving hard problems and navigating within complexity. We pride ourselves on being what we call part of the 100% club, where there's studies or surveys done by Gartner where they ask the users of supply chain software and supply chain planning software of their willingness to recommend the software to others. And GAINS is the only vendor in a recent Gartner report where 100% of survey respondents said that they would recommend GAINS. So we're very proud of that, and we think it's a testament to our capabilities. Yeah. Now, as the Vice President of Industry Solutions, I take a pulse of the market in this VUCA world. So I tried to understand what supply chains need to run effectively now and in the future in terms of methods, approaches, and technologies used for design and planning. And then we use those observations to inform our approach to building our functionality and to help build an ecosystem of partners who can help our customers with navigating this volatility, uncertainty that is plaguing their supply chains. And I'm very happy to be here.
Great. And it sounds like this is going to be a great conversation, I think. And hopefully you bring a lot to it. And I know you guys work with your customers, and hopefully our listeners out there will get some insights into this too. Getting into it, as I mentioned in my open, VUCA is not really new, right? But I think it may be a term that maybe some people don't know very well. They may think of volatility or uncertainty as separate entities. Like I said, there are four parts to it, but I don't know that companies put the four things really together, right, as a collective issue to address and how to do it. So can you kind of talk a little bit about VUCA in general, just kind of what exactly we're talking about here when we speak about this? And I think importantly, how companies may want to think differently about a situation that fits into this instead of just like going with the flow, right? I mean, a ship got stuck. Well, we just deal with it, right? So can you kind of talk a little bit from that standpoint a little bit?
Yes. So you mentioned the four components of VUCA. So there's the volatility, which speaks to change. So it speaks to the speed of change and the magnitude of change that impacts our supply chains. And then uncertainty, you think of it as variability, and the uncertainty or the inability to predict what's going to come next, or an ability to predict what's going to happen in the future. The complexity, this speaks to systems and systems that have many interconnected parts, like a supply chain. All of us that work in supply chain know there's a lot of interconnectedness and a lot of complexity in how our supply chains come together. And with this complexity, it can be very hard to establish cause and effect. And supply chains are just becoming more and more complex every day. Then the A of VUCA, ambiguity, talks about the lack of clarity. And this overall lack of clarity can lead to misunderstanding and miscommunication. So you can see as these four elements of VUCA come together, it can make the challenge of managing supply chain even much more problematic or much more challenging. So what we have seen in many supply chains over the past several years is a lot of reactiveness. And a lot of this could be the reactiveness to VUCA. You see a lot of firefighting and a lot of companies that really want to maybe be more strategic about how they manage their supply chains, but they just don't have the ability to take a step back and think, how can we do this better? How can we better manage around VUCA? And the challenge with VUCA overall is in a recent study by Gartner, 89% of chief supply chain officers believe that we are in a prolonged VUCA environment. And the challenge that a lot of companies have is, yes, so they might have best practices in place to manage their supply chains, but these best practices were developed decades ago when VUCA wasn't as much of an impact on supply chains. Supply chains weren't as complex 30 years ago. There wasn't as much there aren't many products that companies were managing. There weren't maybe as many suppliers that companies are managing. Supply chains have just gotten much more global over the past 30 years. And for variability and uncertainty, there was more stability. There wasn't as much uncertainty around customer demand. There was more certainty around where you would think about placing your inventory. So those old methods from decades ago were fine back then, but now with all of the variability and uncertainty that's plaguing our supply chains, those old methods just aren't working anymore. So going with the flow can be very costly. Companies have reported that for companies that have revenue of at least 500 million USD annually, they report that there is an $82 million annual loss because of VUCA and the disruptions that VUCA is causing their supply chains. So we see an increase in supply chain costs and an ability to fulfill customer orders, so that might inhibit companies' goals and objectives to grow. So you can see that VUCA is becoming more of a challenge, and if you just try to go with the flow, the methods and the tools that are being used just aren't going to cut it anymore.
Yeah. So I think in many ways, what you're describing, I think, is like a mindset shift, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think I've read, if correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe I read that you believe that companies need to embrace the VUCA world that we live in today, which to me sounds somewhat contradictory in many ways, right? I mean, who wants to embrace volatility, right? In many ways.
Mm-hmm.
So, but can you explain what you mean by that, and what happens if companies are not embracing VUCA today?
Yeah. So we have identified what we call a performance gap. And you can think of this performance gap as the gap between how you want your supply chain to operate, how you want to be able to fulfill your customer needs at a reasonable cost. And then the methods that you have in place to actually manage your supply chain to meet those goals. And this performance gap is greatly impacted by VUCA. So the more volatility, uncertainty you have in your environment, again, this is growing exponentially, the more we see a widening of this performance gap as you continue to use these existing methodologies, approaches, tools, technologies. Because again, they weren't necessarily built to manage and embrace VUCA. So this mindset shift is important because without it, that performance gap is just going to get wider. And by fully embracing VUCA and trying to think of how you can rethink your approach to managing your supply chains, how you rethink your approach to leveraging technology, you are in a better position to start to narrow that performance gap, which would give you a competitive edge against your competitors. Another thing that I want to mention here as well is again, when we think of these old methods of working, supply chains today, most supply chains are run in a very deterministic manner, which means that we think of building at the representation of our supply chain that's static. You have one value to represent a relationship between different nodes in that supply chain model. So one value to represent a lead time, even though you know that your lead time will vary, and VUCA will have an impact on what the variability for that lead time range is. You use one value to represent a demand signal, which then gets propagated through the rest of the supply chain. And focusing on a deterministic approach will just inevitably lead to a lot of error because you're not able to take in and manage around and be resilient with VUCA. And this is where the mind shift has to start to change to think more probabilistically. Think of, well, what is the probability of some sort of future occurring? And then start to use that approach to then rethink, again, how you think about managing the supply chain. And that's how you can start to build in more of an approach to embrace and manage VUCA, because you start to think of all the different futures that could occur. Now, not knowing that you're not going to get every future. The Suez Canal example that you gave would be an example of that. But at least starting to build in things that you know could happen as a disruptor, so you can build strategies to mitigate around that if that disruption does impact your supply chain.
Yeah. So it's really, I mean, as I think about my own life and when I was growing up, right? You grow up and you always believe that things can't happen to you, right? But I think this mind shift, what you're in essence saying is that we need to move from it's not going to happen to us to it's probably going to happen to us or it will happen to us. So how do we address that um, in many
Mm-hmm.
ways, right?
Yeah.
So and that's difficult to do, right? I mean, because people don't naturally think like that. So you know how do they get into that mindset to understand that this will happen to us? How do we make that mindset shift? I mean, how do you get people to do that?
Yeah. So one thing that we advocate and that we've seen in companies that have been able to embrace VUCA is to shift to focusing on the decision and focusing on decision making, what decisions you need to focus on in order for the supply chain to run effectively and to meet the goals and objectives of the broader organization. We talk about the composition of a decision. Well, what are the sub decisions that you're making within each higher level decision? How can you make each of those decisions better. And this is how you can start to build in more uncertainty management into each of the decisions that you're making, so that as you are building plans and executing within your supply chain, you are, in a way, defaulting to embracing VUCA, because your decision-making process is considering, well, what is the cause and effect? What's causing me to have to make this decision? And then what is the effect of any decision or action that I might make?
Yeah. So not focusing then as much on all the things that could go wrong, not sitting here saying, "Oh my God, this could happen, all that," but the process when those things happen, right? Is that what you're saying there?
Yeah, it's a mix of both. It is a mix of identifying what could happen and thinking what your mitigation plans, what your playbooks would be if those unexpected actions occur. But then also thinking of what are the decisions that I need to make, and then how could those playbooks be applied when necessary.
Okay. So then as I sit there and say, okay, I have now, this is what I'm going to do, right? I've made that mindset change now and say, this is what I'm going to do. How do I then, what steps do I need to take now to actually put that in
Yeah.
practice?
Yes. So again, this idea of focusing on the decision, start to think, what are maybe some of the high level decisions? Do you have a goal to increase EBITDA, and what are some of the decisions that you have to make in order to do that? Is your goal to grow in a certain region or certain market? Where are the decisions that you have to make in order to achieve that goal? So then you start to catalog those sets of decisions that you're making, prioritize them based on the biggest performance impact, and start to think of the composition of the different decisions. Then you can start to begin to model the decision impact. And that's how you can start to really understand the cause and effect. So that's where you can start to get more visibility of the expected or predicted the predicted outcomes based on the decisions that you might be making. And then you also have to think about how you might orchestrate these decisions together. And when we say orchestrate decisions, we're really talking about how are you aligning decisions across different maybe time horizons. So how are you aligning a decision that you might make in the strategic time horizon, such as where do I want to place a warehouse, which might be a network design issue. And then align that to decisions that you might make in the tactical time horizon, which might be, what is the inventory mix that I need to have within my network, and how much product needs to be placed in different distribution centers or warehouses based on projected customer demand, and then so forth, linking those decisions to the operational decisions.
Yeah. So, I mean, you mentioned in there, it was a lot in there, but you mentioned like, do I need to change warehouse locations, things like that. So, from that, can you talk a little bit about that? Is that then looking at this process as completely redesigning your approaches and operations, and maybe even the technologies you utilize in this process? Is there somewhere in between, going full bore, revamp everything? Um,
Yeah, so it's somewhere in between. So when I mentioned that performance gap earlier, and I had shared that a lot of companies are trying to close the performance gap with using methods, techniques, and tools. And there are many methods, techniques, and tools that companies are using that are more modern. They might not go far enough to close that performance gap, but they are a good starting point. You then need to think about how can you add incremental improvements. And again, it might be starting to focus on areas with the most impact. for these incremental improvements. So you can start with what you have and then build upon that. And then what we are building at GAINS is a way for companies to incrementally add capabilities and services. So if you've already invested in a set of technologies, you don't have to rip it out and replace it with something new. You can use specific technologies to turbocharge what you already have in order to try to reduce that performance gap.
Yeah. Okay. So, as we talk about this, obviously the goal, anytime you rethink your supply chain, I mean, one of the keys to that is to minimize volatility and disruptions that take place in it. And that's why we're here having this conversation today, right? We also know that it's really impossible to do it. You can't eliminate these things entirely. So from that standpoint, as companies look to do these projects and adapt to the VUCA world that we're in today, what are the keys that you see out there to help impact or reduce the impact of volatility and some disruptions? I mean, are there things out there that you think that companies can do or should do?
Yeah. So one big thing is to start scenario planning. So again, thinking of different scenarios that could impact your supply chain and start to get a sense for the likelihood of those scenarios occurring. And you can start to use that as an input into decision making. And doing scenario planning can also help to better understand that cause and effect of a different decision that you can make. And scenario planning is something that, again, companies that are at any state of being can start to employ to start to embrace volatility. Another is to think about creating a set of playbooks, which I alluded to earlier. This idea of, if you've created scenarios, come up with a sense of what could possibly befall your supply chain. Have playbooks in place so that everyone in the organization knows that if an event actually does occur, you have a place to go to figure out what actions or steps or decisions need to be made in order to mitigate around that disruption.
Yeah. So, as you talk about scenario planning and some of these other things, are there technologies out there? I mean, some companies probably have these things in place already. They can utilize their existing technologies, but what kind of technologies do you see that can help you do some of this stuff?
Yes, and there are three that I'll focus on today. So the first is our cloud environments. Now the cloud isn't new, but most supply chain technologies are not run on environments that are purpose built for cloud. And the benefit of a purpose-built cloud environment is that you can take advantage of scalability and speed. So again, this idea of complexity and being able to run data to see connections between these complex systems is more efficient in a cloud-based environment than on older environments. Then the second is composable technology. And when we think about composable, you can think about a building block and how you can assemble and reassemble your environment or your software to meet the needs of today, but then be able to disassemble and reassemble as necessary to meet the needs for tomorrow. So as you see VUCA impacting your supply chain differently, you can reassemble how your technology is structured to best support the new way of working. Yeah. And the third is using better math. And we think of this as having the right mix of data science. So we think of data science as artificial intelligence and machine learning, and mixing that with decision science, so that you can make higher quality decisions. But again, as I alluded to earlier, this is something where a technology vendor like GAINS can meet you where you are and can take what you already have in place and make those incremental improvements using our cloud environment or composable environment and the better math to supercharge what you already have in place.
Yeah. So we've talked about a lot of different things. You've given some great advice so far on here. Once a company has taken some of these steps, that mindset shift to start with, right, and the redesign of your approaches and your operations technologies, and building a tech stack to enable you to manage this process, right? And I think this is where maybe companies maybe get into trouble. But is this something once you get that all in place, is it something you just set and forget at that point?
No, no, that's one of the big
Big problems.
challenges to actually
Yeah.
be able to achieve these goals. So that's the approach a lot of companies have today, which has gotten them into the predicament that they are in. There needs to be constant review of your environment, constant recalibration. And this is the review and recalibration of the decisions that you're making to ensure that the decisions and the actions from them are aligned with the company's goals and objectives, and continuous review of the different policies that you have in place, again, to make sure those policies are current with the environment that you're working in and with the company goals and objectives. So this idea of constantly reviewing is critical to
Yeah.
ensuring that you're managing VUCA.
Yeah, I think that's probably a thing that in many, not just this, but in many technology deployments, especially companies make that mistake, right? I mean, they put it in and they just assume, okay, once I put it in, everything's good, and
Right,
it's not.
right.
um, yeah. So this whole process, a final question I want to get to, this whole process, a lot involved in this and changing this, like we said, the mindset shift, the redesign of approaches, etc. It's not easy to make change in companies, especially established companies for that matter. So, is there any final advice that you might offer to help a company get jump started on this process and to make sure not just they do it, but it can be successful?
Yeah, I say the biggest thing, the number one thing is to find and work with experts who know this well. And when I say this, I mean know operations research very well. So know supply chain methods and approaches and nuances very well. Working with people who know data science very well, who know practical applications for using machine learning or other artificial intelligence approaches to improve supply chains, working with folks that understand decision science very well.
Yeah.
And also folks who understand the technology and the technology evolutions very well, so that you can be steered towards a approach that has a very high likelihood of achieving results once it's deployed and in a nice steady state. We want you to make sure that you're doing this right the first time, so that
Yep.
you don't have to rip and replace all the work you would have done to try to embrace VUCA. Do it once, do it well with people who actually know what they're doing.
Yeah. And how often have you heard stories in the past of companies that put in a process or a technology and it wasn't right the first time, or they didn't do the things they needed to do to take advantage of it, and then 3 years later they're still using it and still not getting any value out of it because they didn't put in the work
Brian,
initially.
if I had a dollar for every time.
Yeah. Thank you, Amber. We're just about out of time. If our listeners want to learn more on this topic or get in touch with you guys, how might they do that?
Yes, you can reach out to us at Gains. We have our website. We're also on LinkedIn. Check out our podcast, Gains On Podcast, to hear more from Gains experts.
Yep, great. I want to thank my guest today, Amber Salley of Gains, and all of you out there who took time out of your day to listen to us today. It was a great discussion. Until next time, this is Brian Straight, and you've been listening to Talking Supply Chain. Talking Supply Chain is produced by Supply Chain Management Review and Peerless Media. You can find it on SCMR.com, supplychain247.com, iTunes, Google Podcasts, or wherever you find your podcasts. For more information on this topic or to sign up for our weekly newsletter, a print or a digital subscription to our publication, visit scmr.com. We hope you will join us for our next episode. For Supply Chain Management Review, I'm Brian Straight, and thank you for listening.